show birds that are more abundant in the collision data than expected based on eBird. So they're colliding a lot. And so the top one, no surprise. Actually, I am surprised. It's ovenbird, not white-throated sparrow. But white-throated sparrow is third or fourth. And then the ones down here at the bottom on the left that are colliding less frequently than expected. Eastern phoebe, blue-gray gnatcatcher, warbling vireo, eastern kingbird. Things that are abundant during migration, but they're not colliding. And you can see based on just how I colored these bars, that all the birds that don't give flight calls are underrepresented in the collision data, and all the birds, or many of the birds, all the birds that are overrepresented do give flight calls. Okay, so we did some other things that I won't go into, and basically, can advance. Think that our results do show that flight calls have some relationship to whether birds hit buildings. The question is this, well, first of all, why, and also, does this have anything to do with light? Okay, so is this a differential response, like I suggested, where birds that make flight calls are drawing each other into artificial light? So that's a bit tricky to answer. You'd have to go out and probably do experiments, but we did have another source of data based on Dave's work at McCormick Place. And so not only have Dave and Mary been picking up birds at McCormick Place and counting how many they find and bring them to the museum, for 20 years or so they've also been noting how many lights are on in the building. And this is fairly straightforward because there are these window bays in McCormick Place, and 17 to be exact, and they can document fairly easily how much light or some relative amount of light that's coming out of the building at night each day. And so this gives us an opportunity to test, well, is the amount of light that's coming out of this building predict how many species, how many individuals of each species are being found the next day? And indeed it does. So the amount of light at McCormick Place strongly predicts how many birds are colliding. And actually this is something that we know intuitively, but actually in the scientific literature has really not, this direct relationship between light levels and collisions has really not been shown before. But only species that make flight calls have increased collisions with increased light. So the species, this blue line, are all of your flycatchers, vireos, wrens. They're still colliding in enough numbers that we have data, but the number of collisions is not increasing strongly with the amount of light, whereas for your warblers, your thrushes, your sparrows, when there are more lights on, they're colliding a whole lot more. Other things that you might think about, like habitat, are these birds found in the canopy? Understory, do they like open habitats, edge habitats, things that could affect how they interact with buildings. Essentially these did not influence the data. All of these species, regardless of their habitat, were colliding more with increased light. So we think we found that nocturnally migratory species that use flight calls are attracted to artificial light in larger numbers than species that don't. And so again, this needs to be tested experimentally, but it's interesting to me as an evolutionary biologist who studies bird migration and other aspects of avian biology, because it suggests that how species sense the world around them, how they could interact with something like artificial light, could actually have a connection with their social biology, that is, how they're communicating with each other as they're flying through the air. And it also raises the possibility that many of these birds that are migrating at night may have different strategies for how they're doing it that we have no idea. So all these things, go ahead. It's in this great Charlie Harper painting. We have woodpeckers, thrushes, vireos. These are all passing overhead at night, but potentially they're getting from point A to point B in really different ways, some of them communicating with each other while they're doing it. Potentially some of them even seeing artificial light in different ways than others. And it's kind of just the tip of the iceberg in terms of our knowledge about what's going on. Flight calls are, as you might imagine, not the whole story. So there are some notable exceptions of birds that we don't find in the collision data set that we can't explain based on this flight call explanation. So chipping sparrow, common bird everywhere, all over eastern North America. There are very, very few in the collision data set. And we have no idea why. So your guess is as good as mine on that one. And we replicated this whole study in Cleveland. So different site and very similar dynamics for some reason. They're not finding any chipping sparrows or red-eyed vireos there either, even though you can see them when you go out bird watching. Okay, so next steps for this kind of project, we're actually focusing on what can we do. Obviously we want to raise awareness about light and its direct. We can show very clearly that it's having an impact on bird collisions. But how can we do this other than saying that it exists? Some of you might be aware of this new project at Cornell called BirdCast, where they use radar and past records of bird migration to predict on what nights there ought to be a lot of bird migration. Well, collaborating with some of those folks, and we're actually pairing the data from McCormick Place, which is the only data set of its kind where for 20 years we have records on levels of light and collisions. You can go to the next slide. To ask how things like weather patterns and the amount of artificial light predicts how many collisions there are, and maybe that could help groups like yours actually predict even better when to monitor. And so this brighter yellow colors is supposed to be the amount of collisions that are occurring. So yellow is a night with a lot of collisions, and this is driven by the McCormick Place data. And when there's highlighted McCormick Place, there's a lot of collisions, but of course when there's a lot of migration density as detected from the radar data, that's when you see the most collisions. So we're trying to look at this in more detail to see, well, how much migration does there need to be? How much reduction in light does there need to be where we start seeing fewer collisions? And when do we need to turn the lights off? Okay, so that's what we're doing with the social biology and the light levels. The other thing that we've been working on has more to do with change through time. Advanced. So the other major piece of these data that is truly remarkable is not just that the specimens are there, not just that they've been prepared, but for every single one of them, Dave measured them himself. So all of these things, so you can figure out in your head how many measurements there are, how many handwritten measures. So that's an awful lot of data on bird measurements. And this is what kind of got me into working with this. It's just, as a scientist, just, see data and get excited. And so, why is a lot of data on the measurements of birds or other animals that goes through 40 years consistently, why is that interesting? Well, one of the major patterns across animal diversity has to do with how big animals are and where they live. And so there's this really strong pattern that's been recognized since the 1840s called Bergman's rule, where in many cases animals that live in colder and more northern environments tend to be larger. Animals that live closer to the poles and in warmer environments tend to be smaller. And this is thought to be due to metabolism and physiology. So the larger you are, the larger body volume you have compared to your surface area. And so the better you are at retaining heat in cold conditions. But as you might imagine, it's a lot more complicated than that, and understanding body size to this day is a really central question in biology. And you can just keep going. And so even today, this is a review paper that came out 2017, which I guess I can't say that was last year anymore. scientists are still debating Bergman's rule. So what drives this relationship between body size and environment? So it's a very present topic, and you can imagine it's a very present topic because of the warming of the globe. And so if animals are change their body size geographically according to the temperature, what's happening through time as overall the climate is warming? And so several people have pointed out in the scientific literature that shrinking body size could be an ecological response to climate change, declining body size, this universal response to global warming. These are all review papers. And so for our research questions, we wanted to use this data set to ask whether there's evidence of this using this kind of very unique data set from Chicago. Are birds changing their body size through time over the past 40 years of very rapid climatic change? And what are the consequences of this, considering that all these birds are migratory? So just to review the data set, for this we looked at the 52 species that had the most data, so more than 100, again almost 1,400 specimens per species. Again, these are mostly passerine birds. I think we had Sora rail and yellow-bellied sapsucker in here too. The rest were songbirds. And one interesting thing is that these birds are all funneling through Chicago on their migrations. And they're all coming from somewhere north of here, and they're all going somewhere south of here. But beyond that, they come from a diversity of places. So boreal forest, edge of tundra in some cases, grasslands. And then they're going to really diverse places. So, you know, everything from the junco at your feeder just south of Chicago, all the way to, I don't know, let's say Connecticut warblers wintering in Bolivia. Okay, so tremendous diversity of places involved. And again, these are the top 10 species. Slide through that again. So if we want to know how body size is changing through time, we have to be able to estimate it. And this turns out to be something ornithologists love to get in great arguments about, how you quantify the body size of a bird. Turns out we think that the measurement of the leg is actually pretty good. Now the mass is actually pretty terrible for estimating body size within a species. Anyone know why that would be? Yeah, so even in a day, a migratory bird will just change its mass so widely. So they put on fat for migrating, and then when they're done with their migratory leg, they sometimes completely emaciate. And you can see that in the birds that you're finding collision. Some are real fat, and some are really skinny. So mass does a good job of estimating body size between species, but not within species. Now wing, a lot of ornithologists have used wing to estimate body size in birds, but it turns out to be tricky because birds that migrate longer distances have longer wings, and so you might be measuring something else other than body size. And we certainly know that birds of similar sizes can have very different length wings. So we think that the leg is the best. Beak. I'm not talking about beaks tonight. Maybe some other time. So despite all this variation in mass, and I'm jumping right into the results here, we see pretty good evidence for a lot of species for declines in mass. So each of these blue lines is an individual species, and whether or not it's a significant trend, and the red line is all of the data together, and you can see that most of the lines are going down, so mass, despite its wide variation, does seem to be declining through time, which is pretty interesting. We go forward. Now tarsus, which we think is an even more sensitive measure of body size, is also declining. Almost all of the species are losing tarsus length. And this, you can't look at magnitude here, but I'll show that in a minute. This is just relative length. These birds are declining in tarsus length. This is what it looks like more kind of raw. The y-axis there is the actual length of the tarsus of different species in millimeters. So the longest bird is hermit thrush, the pale blue line at the top. The shortest one is Tennessee warbler. And if you squint, maybe you can see the lines are just barely going down. This equates to about maybe 1.5 millimeters off of the length of the tarsus in 40 years. I want to emphasize that you need a lot of data to get this kind of pattern. So it's really only because Dave's measured so many damn birds that we can have a plot like this and actually see anything meaningful. Okay, but wing, which is correlated with the rest of the measurements, the wings of these birds are getting longer. So this is just the straight up measurement of wing, increasing in many birds, but not all, if you go to next. And this is relative wing length. So the length of the wing relative to the tarsus, essentially. And you can see that nearly all of them are getting longer. So even in birds that are their overall wing length is getting shorter, their body size is still shrinking faster, so the wing relative to the body is getting longer. And so this is a nearly universal pattern of increasing wing length in all of these birds. So just to summarize, pick up sticks here. The green line is an estimate of body size from all of the data. The blue is the tarsus, the purple is mass. Those are all declining, and then that wing, the red line, is going up in a very strikingly different pattern from the rest of the measurements. Okay, so what's going on here? Why is this body size shrinking? I wouldn't have done so many incrementally advancing slides if I it's fine, it's fine. Why are these wings getting longer while the body size is shrinking? And why, big question to me, why is this happening across all these 52 species, pretty much, which breed in these really different places and spend the winter in these different places? I won't go through most of the analyses that we've done, but basically what we did to test this is we wanted to know, are there big climatic variables like temperature and precipitation, and estimates of how many resources were available that we could, that data sets that exist across the same 40 years that we could compare to these body size trends and ask if any of them are predicting the pattern. And to do that, we have to estimate where each of these species are coming from. Remember, we're just in this passage set on migration. So hermit thrushes, they're filtering through Chicago, but they're probably coming from somewhere in the boreal forest from central Wisconsin up to Hudson Bay and so forth. Gray-cheeked thrushes are coming from even further north and going down to the Amazon. So we essentially, for every species, pulled out 40 years of climatic data from every one of these ranges. Okay, and cut right to the chase. The strongest determinant of body size was the summer temperature on the breeding grounds. So June temperature, all these birds are somewhere north in June, laying eggs and developing. And this is a plot just of temperature. And hopefully you're not surprised that it's going up. It's not going up consistently. Some years are warmer than others, as to be expected, which turns out to be important. But each of these points is somewhere the temperature from the breeding range of one of these species, and together it's all increasing in temperature. And so I'll show you that this predicts the size of the bird very well. But to do that, I've actually taken temperature here and flipped it. So this is the inverse temperature, so it looks like it's going down, even though it's actually going up. To show the next slide, the pattern of the tarsus is very, very well aligned with this. So these are the fluctuations in tarsus length through time. Again, 70,000 measurements went into these fluctuations, which, you know, the whole thing is about 1 millimeter of tarsus length, so very slight patterns, but there's strong support that as temperature increases in the summer, body size goes down. In summers, when temperature is cooler, the birds coming through Chicago are bigger. Okay, so this result, warming summer temperatures that leads to smaller bodied birds. This is predicted by some of the theory I was talking about. and has been studied in other birds and other animals, but really hasn't been shown so universally across species, which may have something to do with our large data set. And it suggests that this influence of warming, global warming, is very widespread on a wide diversity of species. Yeah. So now the mystery question is, why is wing length increasing? And I'll just spend a couple minutes on this right here at the end. Short answer, we don't totally know, but there's some interesting possibilities. So as I said, the length of a bird's wing is positively correlated with how far it migrates and also how fast it migrates. So something like a white-rumped sandpiper has a super long migration, and they do it incredibly fast. They have very long pointing wings. And with global warming, one thing that people have been thinking about for a while is that the ranges, the breeding ranges of some of these animals might be moving towards the poles. So as things warm here, habitat could be tracking further and further north. And so these birds may have, if their winter ranges are staying relatively constant, they may have further to go. And they may have less time to get there, actually, because springs could be advancing as well. So it's possible that these movement of ranges, or the advancement of spring greening, so when you see really early green up, that these things could be selecting for birds that migrate faster and longer, and they have longer wings, and that overall it's leading to an increase in wing length. Here's a projection for blackpoll warbler, which now breeds somewhere around here. Audubon Society projected that by 2080, they're going to be, God knows where out there.
Wow.
Now, this, part of the reason that morphological data sets and other sources of information are important is that this is a very kind of naive projection. It's just taking climate and kind of projecting for it to where it ought to be, and assuming the birds will go there. But with this data from Chicago, we see that all kinds of other things are changing. Their body size, their wing length, and so what the birds are actually going to do and how they're responding is pretty complicated and difficult to study. But we think maybe there's one avenue that actually leverages these specimens that have been collected over decades. And this is the last data slide. This is just a possibility for a future project. So this is a map here of chemical isotopes which are found in the earth and get incorporated into animals' bodies. And basically the take-home message is that there's variation across the earth in certain chemicals, and that these chemicals get incorporated into bones and feathers of birds, and we can actually study them and how they change. And since we have 40 years of these specimens coming through Chicago, we could actually pair that with a map like this over time and ask whether these birds have been coming from different places through time, which could give some evidence, for example, for whether they're shifting their ranges further north, as I suggested earlier. So we're hoping to be able to do that soon. Okay, so just in summary, this very large collision data set that all of you helped to build so far has revealed some interesting differences in how bird social biology interacts with artificial light, and potentially how they collide with buildings, and potentially other things that they're doing during migration that we don't know anything about. And we also see a really complex but very universal, very uniform change in shrinking bodies and lengthening wings in more than 50 species. And I guess the big thing as a teaser, we all have more to come someday as well. Keep doing it. I'd like to see less data through time. Dave and I'll be joking about this. But thank you all for coming out in the sleet, and for going out in the sleet and picking up dead birds, as I'm sure you've done before. And I'll take any questions. So thank you.